Welcome to Windrider's 13th season, and just thank you so much for being here. It means the world to us. When we talk about bringing you films told through the lens of hope, it doesn't mean that we look for films that are sugarcoating everything. It means that we look for films that are telling stories about big human issues where something constructive is being done to address that issue. And one of our hopes is that it will encourage you to look at the things that you care deeply about, and that you'll think of something that you can do to respond to that. And tonight's film is an amazing Lens of Hope film. It's about two icons in our world who care deeply about social injustice, and their conversation with Doug shares their wisdom, their compassionate hearts, their surprising humor, and they're going to teach you about enduring joy, which we just felt was so important during these times. So thank you.
So tonight's film is Mission Joy, Finding Happiness in Troubled Times. When we set out this year to find films for this event that provided an audience with a lens of hope, we in a world that's so often full of chaos and disorientation and hopelessness, this film perfectly fit the bill. I think we could take for granted what we're about to watch here. A private interview with two spiritual icons of our age. We've become accustomed to news journalists interviewing famous individuals from around the world. And during this season, there have been several blockbuster films that are filled with imaginative superheroes and amazing special effects. But when it comes to real-life superheroes, it doesn't get much better than Archbishop Desmond Tutu and His Holiness the Dalai Lama. So this film is going to give us a unique opportunity to come alongside these two individuals for an entire week, to share walks with them, experiences together, listen to their reflections on life, observe their profound and trusting relationship with each other, be moved by some intimate moments that reveal their deepest heartaches, and as Terry mentioned, also be infected with their contagious laughter and sense of humor. The British film critic David Thompson has stated that in an age of special effects, the most special effect of all is a close-up of a human face. The filmmakers of Mission Joy have provided us with a beautiful close-up of these two faces and a glimpse into the hearts of these two amazing individuals. Thank you for being with us tonight. Tonight we are fortunate to have two special guides who are going to walk with us on this journey of joy. Douglas Abrams is the author of the Book of Joy. How many of you purchased that out in front of the theater here tonight? Congratulations, thank you. We sold out on that book. Kepler's bookstore here in Menlo Park received the money for that. And professor of neuroscience and vice chair of the Department of Psychiatry at the University of California, San Francisco, Dr. Elissa Epel. A big Windrider welcome to our two special guests.
Thank you.
So as I mentioned, we're going to do a Q&A afterwards, and in the second Q&A, we will open this up to the audience for text questions and real questions. But in the interest of time, we're going to have some questions that I've prepared for our two guests here. So Elissa, we are just delighted to have you here. It's nice to have a local expert on joy just up the road here to come in today. So you're a self-proclaimed stress scientist. I bet you your parents wondered when you told them that's what you wanted to be when you grew up, what the heck that was. But you have been studying stress and suffering for a number of years, and then more recently also joy. So give us a little science primer. an intro to Joy 101. What do we need to
Okay.
know about the science of joy?
Thank you, Will. I also like to say I'm, of course, a stressed scientist. People study their own problems, right? If you're a psychologist. So I like to think of joy as kind of the queen on top of a whole basket of ingredients that we call emotional well-being. And many of you have read the Book of Joy, so you'll see that there are pillars of joy: humility, gratitude, compassion. And all of those components, actually, they came from these amazing conversations and the deep wisdom of His Holiness and Archbishop. But we have an amazing science behind each of those. And it is, while I've been studying suffering, depression, stress, the other story to that is resilience, recovery, and growth, and how that springs from facing adversity in life, how it stretches us to deepen our appreciation of life, our social connections, our gratitude for what we have. And so the title of this, The Joy Through Troubled Times, is really one of the biggest truths that we know. We always have inevitably challenges being a human in this world, and we probably all feel like we're in a particularly precarious moment of global challenge as well as personal challenges. And that's right, we will always have both. And we will always be struggling with things, well, I'm going to say the climate crisis for the rest of our lives. So how do we face life with such challenges? And what you'll hear tonight is that the regenerative energy of joy is the light. It's the path. It is the precious response to what's in front of us that we have no control over. So in the science, to address your question, what we do is we follow people and we say, who gets depressed and who gets sick? And the amazing studies that rise up are things like optimism, purpose in life, and yes, of course, suffering, stress, depression cause the opposite. We know all that, but we've been ignoring this beautiful science of well-being. And this is a new era that we're in where the field of science, including the National Institute of Health, is turning toward joy and well-being and saying, oh, I think we've missed something really important. And we need this. This is possibly the big answer to the epidemic of mental health that we're having. And so now we're doing these studies trying to manipulate or infuse things like gratitude, awe, kindness to others, and look at the short-term effects and really understand in a close-up, granular way how we can promote joy and well-being. But the big studies that follow people across their life show that it's the queen, it's positive well-being, and what we call pro-social attitudes, which is kindness, compassion, altruism. These are the source of happiness.
Great, thank you. Doug, we're going to meet these two individuals in a few minutes, and you're the fortunate one who gets to walk with them into this space. So you set out to discuss joy. Talk a little bit about the science piece and what the two of them understood about why science was important for this project.
Thank you, Will. Well, first of all, I want to just say thank you all for coming out to watch Archbishop Tutu and the Dalai Lama's film. On their behalf, I would like to thank you for being here, for your part of sharing the joy. It was an incredibly profound experience to get to, as you said, companion them in this dialogue in the Book of Joy, and now in the film that you're about to see. But when I met with the Dalai Lama in Washington, D.C., before we went to Dharamsala, he said, this is not to be a Christian book or a Christian film or a Buddhist book or a Buddhist film. This is about the universal human experience. And he said, you should go and talk to the scientists and see whether they confirm or contradict what we have to say. And it was that spirit of inquiry and openness that I think has allowed the book, and as you see tonight, the film, to really speak to people all around the world because regardless of our religion, our race, our nationality, ultimately, as the Dalai Lama would say, same human experience.
Great. So if you go on the website for this film, missionjoy.org, that's all one word, missionjoy.org, you will see that there is a link to what's called the Big Joy Project. And it is described as the largest ever citizen science project on joy. So I clicked on the link and went to this website that's hosted by UC Berkeley and UC San Francisco and Harvard too. Is that the other school that's involved? And there is an experiment that you can participate in. And so I did. 7 minutes for 7 days. And it's an introduction to the science of joy. And you're a part of the research project. So last week I did that. I learned a little bit about laughter, about shifting perspective, gratitude, being a force for good, kindness, celebrating somebody else's joy, and exploring wonder, beauty, and awe. That's a pretty good way to spend 7 minutes of every day. So Elissa, tell us how we might enlist this crowd here to become scientists next week.
I would be so happy if you would be open to trying this 7-day program. As Will said, it's just a few minutes of your day. And if you think it's worth something, pass it on. Our biggest hope is that this goes viral and really is in every country. So it not only spreads experiences and you can see what works for me. Do I feel joy? Do I feel less stress? But it also allows us to open up a door to understanding what works for whom. We're all very different. And so while we have a basket of options, the laughter might not make you laugh or make you feel more positive emotion. You'll see we measure these components of emotional well-being. So far we have 11,000 people from 120 countries who have signed up. And we hope to get to the millions, and we hope for many discoveries to improve the science of joy. Right now, there are 2 ways for transformation in my little worldview as a scientist. One is through emotional and transformative experiences that you have in your own body. And that's when I watched this film, I just thought, Doug and Peggy have so much wisdom. They knew exactly what they were doing. I was with my son who doesn't cry during movies, and I saw a tear, and he stayed the whole time, and it's very impactful. The other way, another North Star for our society is science. Science will lead to changes in funding and policies and culture eventually. And so we really need intervention data like this to help us learn about the practices, joy practices, and what works for whom and how to optimize them. So we have a lot of excitement about this project and hope, and I'm grateful to be part of it. It's an honor and a joy.
Super exciting, and there are only 152 countries, so 120, most of them. And you'll help us get to the rest.
Well, Elissa, we are just so grateful that you were able to join us for a little bit this evening, and we look forward to being a part of this group of scientists who are helping to make this a better world that we live in.
Thank you so much, Will and Terry and everyone, for being part of this.
And Doug, do you want to say a word about what we're about to watch here?
Well, it's an amazing privilege to get to share with you, to invite you on the perhaps the most awesome road trip ever to Dharamsala, India, to spend a week with the Dalai Lama and Desmond Tutu, and to get to learn from them, laugh with them, and experience what we got to experience. And it was so overwhelming and so amazing. The only thing that actually made it tolerable was knowing that we could bottle it up and share it with the world. And with the book, we've been fortunate that over, I think it's approximately 1 in every 200 Americans has read the book. And the film has already reached 13.4 million people. And so it is just an incredible privilege to be able to share this with you tonight, and I look forward to hearing about your experience. And please go back and go on to the website, tell us what you think as well about the film, and thank you for sharing the joy with others.
Great. Please stick around after the film. We're going to have a Q&A follow-up with Doug, and silence your cell phones and use them to text your questions in after the screening. Enjoy the film. Well, wow. You got to spend an entire week with those two individuals, and I feel like at the end of that film, we had a glimpse into how beautiful their friendship was with that last question that you asked. Surely there are so many scenes that you wish you had included that give us a glimpse into who they were as people and in their friendship. Anything else you would want to add to just those final moments that really gave us a glimpse into the two of them?
Well, first of all, thank you and Terry and the whole team for putting this on tonight. Really quite a privilege to be here. I have to just start by saying it's really emotional to see Arch on the screen. He left us in December, and it's just always when I see the film now, it's like he's right there. And it's just so beautiful to know that his spirit can live on with the film. It was such a gift to all of us. I think that the fact is that we knew this was going to be significant, Will, for the world, but we had no idea how significant it was going to be for the two of them. These great spiritual masters, as we said, don't get to hang out with their buddies and have a beer very often, And the Chinese pressure on South Africa had kind of kept His Holiness away from South Africa, and Arch's doctors weren't allowing him to leave. And so we knew that there was this one moment that we had to get this, because the doctor said he could leave. And we flew him to Dharamsala, and we knew we had one chance to make this happen. There was no take two. And I think what you see in that amazing, that amazing love, it's this incredible model of what's possible for all of us. That incredible delight in one another. And I think that you get such a picture of that in the film, of just, how they're delighting in being with one another. I think, you really do see the teasing. Is there anything you didn't see in the film that we got to see? Well, here's a story. So I was talking to Arch before we flew to Dharamsala, and he said, I'm a little nervous crossing swords with the Dalai Lama. He's this amazing intellect, and I'm instinctual. And I thought it was this amazing, here's this great legendary hero who was able to express his vulnerability and his nervousness. And, a lot of people come to the film for the Dalai Lama and they leave being like, wow, about the Dalai, Desmond Tutu. And you see this fantastic complementarity of, who the Dalai Lama is and who Archbishop Tutu is, and how they merge the full kind of spiritual life. And you found that at this mountaintop where all the world's religions meet is that love and that friendship and that Ubuntu and that connection. And I think that's really what they showed us.
Just a reminder to the audience, you can text in questions, and I've already gotten a couple of those, and we also have microphones set up on both sides here if you want to ask a question. I'll ask one or two more, and then we'll take some of your text questions. You know, for me, some of the really poignant moments were the tender moments that were visual. When you asked the question about death and you saw Arch respond about his own death, and then the camera caught the Dalai Lama and you could tell he was praying, meditating, thinking deeply about that. And then just the tender moments of them clasping each other's hands, and that scene, the scene of We Are the World, where Arch is dancing and the Dalai Lama is so awkward. I mean, just all those are just so wonderful. You know, you put those juxtaposed to the apartheid and the Chinese treatment of Tibet and all these big issues in the world, and the bookends were just wonderful. Talk a little bit about that part of it.
About the juxtaposition,
the big issues and then the tender moments.
I mean, I just think that one of their great teachings is that ability to go from the depths of pain and despair and the horror of what is happening to that lightness of being and that sense of, but we're still human even in the mess. And we have one another even in the mess. And I think that ability to, I met with Paul Ekman, one of the world's leading emotion researchers, and he said, the Dalai Lama has the most extraordinary micro expressions of anyone he's ever met. And that you're looking to the Dalai Lama's face. First of all, you hold the Dalai Lama's hand, and there is power. Like he could jujitsu you across the room. It's like moving me around, kind of like. And you look into his face, and he just feels what you're feeling. But and something sad will happen, and he'll experience that, and then it's gone. And I think that, that experiment that they talk about how the practices that we give in the book and in the meditations, that you can cultivate that capacity to move through, as the Dalai Lama said, when we are moving through difficult times more quickly. And, this was that real wonderful debate between them of how much of our negative emotions do we need to experience? And, Arch was, the Dalai Lama was saying, we're able to kind of not hang out there nearly as much as we do. And Arch was saying, but sometimes we're going there whether we want to or not. And I think they were really saying, you don't have to set up, you don't have to build a house there. You can transition through them.
We had a question from one of our audience members about what was in the book that wasn't in the film. And one of my favorite parts of the book is the 8 Pillars of Joy, which are in the film, but they're not named the same way. So say a little bit about the Pillars of Joy and how you chose which ones to weave in the ways you did.
Well, so film, as anybody knows who's been involved in creating narrative film, is incredibly linear and really compressed. So we actually were only able to get 3 of the 8 pillars of joy in: perspective, forgiveness, and compassion. So the 8 pillars of joy, it starts with perspective. And they said that really that's the foundation for everything, how you see your life. That ability to step back and see your life or the political realities in that longer sweep of time and history, that's the basis. From that perspective, you are able to develop humility because you actually see that you're one of the 7 billion people, no greater or no lesser than anyone else. And then that humility allows you to laugh at yourself, and that's humor. And from that humor, that almost shaking you free of the rigidity, comes acceptance. And you're able to accept the reality of what is. And one of the things that was so fascinating about the chapter on the book on acceptance was it's acceptance is not acquiescence. It's the place from which real change can occur from accepting that reality. And then from that acceptance, when you accept the reality of what is, you can move into forgiveness and give up the wish of a different past. And then from that forgiveness, you move into gratitude because you're able to really appreciate all that you have been given. And from that gratitude, then you move to compassion, which is that sense of all that I have, I want others to have that, and then that ultimately leads to that sense of generosity and generosity of the spirit, which they show so extraordinarily. So in the book, we're able to go into much more detail, and then we're also, the book has these 3 parts, the nature of true joy, where we're able to tackle all the obstacles to joy as well. So we're able to deal with depression and despair and illness, and which we couldn't in the film, and then do the 8 pillars of joy, and then give 50 pages of their joy practices as well.
Yeah. That's a really beautiful summary of that section. I love what you just did with that.
Thank
great.
you.
Yeah, that's a great part of the book. You mentioned when you started this project the feeling of self-doubt. You have interviewed the Dalai Lama and Desmond Tutu. You've interviewed Jane Goodall. Stephen Hawking. I saw you've interviewed Jimmy Carter, Bono, Carlos Santana. You've been with some heavyweights, and yet still you feel that. And talk a little bit about maybe why that's important to this project.
I think that I have had the opportunity to sit with some amazing people and ask them questions, and I think I always So I actually, just as a little story, I was sitting with Steven Spielberg, and he said every time he starts a film, he's afraid. I was like, what? One of the greatest directors of all time. And it's that sense of doing something different and new. And it's like, even Arch is nervous about crossing swords, has his own self-doubts about crossing swords with the Dalai Lama. And I think this project, of all the interviewing and the projects, really it really felt like it was calling me to something beyond what anything I'd ever done before. And to hold that space for 5 days in the room with them, and allow it to just evolve. And we had an outline, and we had all these questions, these 1,000 questions that we had gotten, but we didn't know where we were going. We knew we had an idea of where some of the good stories were buried and some of their, what their values were. Jimpa and I had spent so much time working together on that. And I have to say this really funny thing. Jimpa, his teen daughter had changed his Skype settings. It was Skype at the time before Zoom, so that he sounded like a chipmunk. And so I'd get on the Skype, and this very dignified Buddhist scholar would come on, and he'd start talking like Alvin and the Chipmunks. And but we had done all that work, but we still really didn't know if we could get it.
There are several versions of this question, and essentially people are saying, how has making this film and this experience changed you personally? And then one observation that came from someone was, you seem lighter and more joyful today than even then.
Thank you. It must be that my daughter's in the room. I'd say, okay, this gets a little personal, but so I grew up with a lot of privilege and opportunity, and also some real suffering, and with a mom who suffered from depression. And I think that I grew up thinking that my job was to run as far away from sorrow and suffering as I could. And in working on this film, I realized that sorrow and joy are 2 sides of the same coin. And that when you look at these 2 amazing beacons of light and joy, they are able to cry as much as laugh. They're able to look at the sorrow and the suffering. And it's like joy and sorrow are like one knob. I know we don't have knobs on stereos anymore, but it's like, one volume dial. And you can either dial it down, and whatever your distraction of, alcohol, drugs, work, that was one of my favorite distractions, and just numb oneself. But the more that you avoid the sorrow, the more you limit the joy. And it's like these guys were telling us to turn it up to 11 and say, experience all the joy, but that means not only will you laugh more, you'll cry more as well.
That reminds me of one of my favorite scenes in the film, and that's the discussion about forgiveness, when Arch recounts the story of his father and his father's passing, and that he had not given him the opportunity to potentially say, I'm sorry. And in that scene, what I thought was beautiful is how you framed it by leaving it silent at the end. There was no rushing in to make him feel better. You and the Dalai Lama and whoever else was in that room just allowed him to sit there with his grief. And you mentioned that then leads to the potential for joy. And I'm just wondering about that scene, anything about that scene that maybe is significant.
Well, we actually sat there with him for maybe 5 minutes. We obviously couldn't do that in the film, but when we were with him, we were just there honoring his grief. And it was so beautiful after, this entire life and this entire, being the icon of forgiveness for the world. And here we got to see him struggle with his own forgiveness and his own grief at not having been able to forgive his dad. That was really, really profound. And another kind of story that's not in the film, I got to interview Archbishop Tutu for 2 days for a legacy project on forgiveness. And he and his family went to England, where they were no longer second-class citizens. And he got the call to come back, and his wife didn't want to go, because not only did it mean going back to being second-class or third-class citizens, it meant breaking up their family, because the kids, because of Bantu education, would have to go to boarding school. And it almost broke up their marriage. And so I said to him, did you ever, I said, there are few marital spats that have been decided by history, and we're glad you went back to South Africa. But did you ever forgive Mama Leah? And did you ever ask for forgiveness from Mama Leah? And at first he got all kind of a little huffy, as man of his generation. He's like, called by God, And then he stopped, and he took that pause, which is that pause of freedom from reactivity. And he said, I'll have to ask her. And he wrote to me a couple weeks later, and he said, I asked Mama Leah, and she said she had forgiven me. Now that's humility.
Yeah, that's quite vulnerable to do that. You mentioned at the beginning that this was not designed to be a Christian film or a Buddhist film. It was meant to be for all people. But there is an interfaith dimension that's actually really instructive at a time when we're not always getting along, people of different religious traditions. And I love the scene at the end where you're walking the labyrinth, and just the imagery of that too. So I know you don't see the film that way, but is there an aspect of that that's actually embedded in there in an intentional way?
Yeah, I think they were very intentional about having this be a universal human film, but obviously they come from their deep traditions. I mean, this is one of the greatest Christian leaders and one of the greatest Buddhist leaders. And what was so amazing is they were able to share their practices, the little pinky dip in the Eucharist. I mean, that was so controversial. That was like the whole thing for Buddhists, for Christians, for everybody. But to them, it's like, hey, this is my tradition. Like, you want to participate? And there was just such a lesson of Ubuntu and shared humanity, and that, under the traditions and the dogma is that universal human search for compassion, for love, for understanding. I mean, I think I mentioned it. I mean, it was like sitting at the mountaintop of where all the world's traditions meet. And it's like, dude, here we are. Let's what do we got in all these traditions that's really profoundly human?
Thank you, that's great. I want to just close with a piece that you wrote on your website. So Doug is prolific as a writer. He's written several books. He also is an editor. He's a sponsor and mentor and fan and champion of other writers. And so if you go on the website Idea Architects, you'll see quite a list of books that ought to be worth reading. If you just start scrolling down, you go, oh, that one looks good, that one looks good. But shortly after Archbishop Tutu died, you wrote a tribute to him. And I want to read it, and then I want you just to talk about what you learned from that man that went into the words that you wrote, because it sounded very intentional how you wrote this tribute, and I'm sure there's just some rich stories. First of all, I just think it's beautiful that you call him Arch. I mean, the Archbishop, and his name is Arch. But here's just one paragraph from that tribute that you wrote on, I think it was on January 5th, which was maybe a week after his death. Is that what it was? Approximately 2 weeks, maybe. The world is dimmer now, without Arch's great light shining from his eyes. He was truly an extraordinary example of what is possible for us, for humanity, when we see, as he said, with the eyes of the heart. It takes time to become human, as he reminded us. I will miss his yippee, his elbow-heavy boogie, his glowing, love-filled eyes, his tears, his tender, soft hand, and of course, that laughter that started out as a giggle became an infectious cackle and ended as a belly-shaking guffaw that made our shared humanity so funny and so perfect. His model of resilience in the face of crushing oppression, strength through compassion, righteous indignation without hatred, are shining qualities of what the future of humanity can and must hold. Wow, that's quite a tribute. Just comment on that.
Well, it's such an unbelievable privilege to get so close to somebody who is such an extraordinary example of what is possible for humanity. Arch never said he was a saint. I saw him irritated. I saw him angry. But like when I asked him once about anger, Dalai Lama was saying we try to get rid of anger. I was like, so what's the difference between anger and righteous indignation? And he said, righteous indignation is not usually about yourself. And there's this way in which he was such a beautiful example of, this, not some sainthood, but of, if we do our work, if we cultivate our hearts, if we try to see with the eyes of the heart and develop that pause, what is possible for us. He was, we called him Arch when we were talking about him, but we also, or in more professional context, but he asked us to call him Father. And, it was like, he was a father for the world. He, really blessed us with that fatherly blessing. And, I think that, you'll have to ask my daughter, but most of the good that, I've tried to pass on as a father was from my dad and, from my father-in-law and from Arch. And that sense of like, how do we take, that sense of what's best in us, give it to one another with a really good sense of humor, pass it on to our kids in a way that can allow us to see that shared humanity. And like that sense of like that we're all children of God. I didn't grow up with that. I grew up in Manhattan. Some people are above other people, and what floor you're on, and it was like the modern trance of better and worse. And he really was able to just see that sense of we're all fragments of God, and that has been something that has touched my heart so profoundly. And I feel like he's still, like my dad, he's still there, kind of, ribbing me and, pushing me to just carry on the love. For as the Bible says, the sins of the fathers, it's fathers, but it's really because it means fathers and mothers, goes on to the second and third generation. But what nobody quotes is the next sentence, which is, and the love of the fathers and mothers goes on for 1,000 generations. And his love will go on for at least that many generations.
Wow, thank you, Doug. That was beautiful. Terry, why don't you come join us here on the stage? We looked for 2 films that we thought would really speak to our current cultural moment and give a lens of hope. And I think last night's film and this one were really beautiful examples. A big hand for Doug Abrams and the Mission Joy.
I can't thank you enough, Doug, for sharing this story and being here with us. And thank you to all of you for showing up.
All right, have a great evening. Go with joy.